The Pacific Ocean had turned the color of gunmetal by the time Sarah Mercer pulled her truck into the parking lot at Naval Base Coronado. She killed the engine, but didn't move. Through the windshield, the last bruised light of Friday evening bled across the horizon, and somewhere beyond that, water in countries whose names she'd learned to forget, pieces of her life were buried in sand and classified folders that no one would ever read. She reached for the rearview mirror and tilted it toward her face. Brown eyes stared back. Steady, unremarkable. The face of a 36-year-old emergency medical technician from San Diego who paid her rent on time and kept her apartment clean, and sometimes woke at 3 in the morning with her hands already reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. On the passenger seat lay a folded memorial program. She picked it up and opened it to the photograph inside. Petty Officer Marcus Dunn. That crooked smile she remembered from a dozen missions from firefights and exfiltrations and long nights waiting in cold positions where the only warmth came from knowing the person beside you would die before letting you down. Marcus had survived 3 combat deployments. He'd survived an IED ambush in Kandahar province that should have killed him. He'd survived surgeries and rehabilitation and the slow grinding return to something that resembled normal life. He had not survived the silence that came after. 1 month ago, the war Marcus Dunn had been fighting alone in his own mind had finally won. And now Sarah was here in a parking lot at Coronado, about to walk into a room full of people who would never know what Marcus had really done, who he had really been, or what it had cost the people who served beside him. She slipped the program into her back pocket, checked her appearance one final time. Jeans, plain gray t-shirt, a thin silver chain around her neck carrying 2 items that meant more to her than anything she owned. A set of dog tags worn smooth from years against skin, and a challenge coin, small and metallic, catching the overhead light from the parking lot lamp. The coin bore markings that no one in that building tonight should recognize. On one side, a trident rendered in a style that differed from the standard Navy SEAL insignia. On the reverse, a sequence of numbers and letters etched into the metal with military precision. GU7-041201. Sarah tucked the chain beneath her shirt collar, locked the truck, and walked toward the officers' club with the measured stride of someone who had learned long ago that the most dangerous places were often the ones where you felt safest. The officers' club at Naval Base Coronado occupied a converted hangar that had been polished into respectability for formal gatherings, while retaining enough military austerity to remind everyone exactly where they stood. Long windows lined one wall, offering views of the Pacific darkening under twilight. The bar stretched along the opposite side bottles, arranged with parade ground precision. Round tables filled the main floor, most occupied by personnel unwinding after a demanding week. But tonight was different. Tonight, the usual Friday atmosphere of relief and casual celebration had been replaced by something heavier. In the adjacent function room, the memorial service for Petty Officer Marcus Dunn had just concluded. Over 100 attendees were filtering back into the main area, their expressions drawn, their conversations muted to the particular frequency of people processing grief they couldn't fully express. Sarah entered through a side door and found a corner table near the windows, positioning herself with her back to the wall and a clear sightline to every exit. The behavior was automatic, as unconscious as breathing. She'd stopped trying to correct it years ago. A waitress approached. Sarah ordered water. No ice. From this position, she could see the bar, the main entrance, the hallway leading to the restrooms, and the door to the function room, where Marcus's photograph still stood on an easel draped in black cloth. She could see the families, the wives holding their husbands' arms a little tighter tonight, the children too young to understand why the adults were speaking so quietly, the older veterans whose eyes carried the particular weight of having attended too many of these services. And she could see the operators. They were easy to spot if you knew what to look for, the way they positioned themselves in any room. The unconscious scanning of entry points, the physical conditioning that no amount of civilian clothing could disguise. They stood in clusters of 3 and 4, drinking with the controlled intensity of men who used alcohol, the way other people use meditation as a tool for managing what lived inside their heads. Sarah watched them and felt the familiar ache of belonging to a world she could never publicly acknowledge. These men were her brothers in a way that transcended blood. She had bled with them, fought beside them, carried their wounded, and mourned their dead. But none of them knew her face, and she could never tell them her name. That was the price of Ghost Unit 7. She'd been sitting alone for nearly 30 minutes nursing her water, her posture unconsciously perfect, despite the casual setting when the first set of eyes found her. Master Chief Warren Dalbeck had been with Naval Special Warfare for 22 years. He'd trained more SEAL candidates than he could count, deployed to every theater of operations the United States had fought in since the early 2000s, and developed an instinct for reading people that bordered on preternatural. He sat at the bar nursing a bourbon, his weathered face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who just said goodbye to another friend lost to the invisible wounds of service. He noticed the woman in the corner the way he noticed everything automatically thoroughly, and with an assessment process so deeply ingrained that it operated below conscious thought. Her posture. Even while seated, she maintained an alignment that spoke of ingrained discipline. Not the rigid formality of someone trying to appear military, but the unconscious carriage of someone whose body had been shaped by years of physical training and operational readiness. Her awareness. When a group of officers passed too close behind her table, her eyes tracked their reflection in the window glass. Peripheral monitoring conducted without appearing to monitor anything at all. And then the glass. A bartender fumbled a tumbler. It shattered against the tile floor with a sharp crack that cut through the ambient noise. Every head in the vicinity turned toward the sound with the normal startle reflex of people interrupted from conversation. The woman's head turned too, but faster, and her hands moved, first shifting from the table surface to a position that Dalbeck recognized with absolute certainty because he'd seen it 10,000 times in operators responding to unexpected stimuli. Her fingers had moved toward her right hip, reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there before her conscious mind caught up with her reflexes and brought her hands back to the table. The entire sequence lasted less than a second. No one else in the room noticed. Dalbeck noticed. He set down his bourbon and was about to push away from the bar when 3 men at a nearby table stood up and began moving toward the woman's corner. Dalbeck recognized them immediately and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Lieutenant Bryce Thatcher led the group. At 29, Thatcher was the kind of operator who excelled at everything measurable and failed at everything that mattered. His scores were exceptional. His tactical proficiency was among the highest in his class. His physical fitness reports read like recruiting advertisements. But behind the polished performance lived an arrogance that Dalbeck had watched grow over the past 2 years, like a tumor that no one wanted to diagnose. Thatcher wore his SEAL Trident pin on his khaki uniform, with the particular prominence of someone who believed the symbol entitled him to judge who else deserved to wear one. His face was flushed from beer and the residual high of a successful training evolution that had concluded earlier that afternoon. Tonight, he was riding the dangerous combination of alcohol accomplishment and the righteous certainty that he could identify a fraud at 50 paces. Flanking him on the left was Lieutenant Garrett Sinclair, phone already in hand, the screen's glow casting blue light across features that carried the eager expression of someone who lived for content. Sinclair documented everything: training exercises, bar outings, operational briefings that shouldn't have been recorded. His social media following had become a point of pride that his commanding officers had noted with increasing concern. Completing the triangle was Petty Officer Dylan Cresswell, whose face displayed the particular blend of skepticism and eagerness that characterized someone who would follow a stronger personality into any situation without questioning where it led. Dalbeck watched them approach the woman's table and felt the cold in his stomach spread. Thatcher stopped 3 feet from her table. His companions arranged themselves in a loose semicircle that blocked her from the rest of the room. The formation was unconscious but unmistakable. 3 predators isolating prey. "Excuse me, ma'am." Thatcher's voice carried a politeness so thin it was practically transparent. "Couldn't help but notice your dog tags. Mind if I ask what unit you served with?" Sarah looked up at him. Her expression revealed nothing. Not hostility, not fear, not even the mild irritation of someone interrupted during a private moment. Just a calm so complete that it should have given Thatcher pause. It didn't. "I attended a memorial service," she said. "I'm not looking for conversation." "That's not what I asked." Thatcher stepped closer. His shadow fell across her table. "Those tags, military issue, or did you pick them up at a surplus store? They're mine." "So you're claiming military service?" Sinclair had his phone raised now, the red recording light blinking steadily. "As what exactly?" "I'm not claiming anything. I attended a service for a fallen operator. That's all you need to know." Cresswell leaned in with exaggerated scrutiny, studying her face the way someone might examine a counterfeit bill. "Funny. You don't look like any operator I've ever met. What was your rate? Your command? Your graduating class?" "That information isn't something I can discuss." Thatcher laughed. The sound was sharp and carried easily across the bar, turning heads at nearby tables. Conversations paused. The particular frequency of conflict had entered the room, and human nature responded the way it always does. People listened. People watched. Phones emerged from pockets. "Let me guess," Thatcher said, his voice rising to ensure maximum audience. "Your service is classified. Super secret squirrel stuff that we're not cleared to know about." "That about right?" Sarah said nothing. "You know what I think," Thatcher continued, playing now to the growing circle of observers. "I think you're one of those stolen valor cases. Somebody who bought some gear online and thought she'd come down to Coronado and pretend she earned it. And you picked the wrong night and the wrong crowd to run that con." The surrounding tables had gone quiet. 50 sets of eyes were fixed on the confrontation. The energy in the room shifted from curious to predatory, with the speed that only a crowd can generate. Recording lights blinked across the darkness like red stars. Sarah's jaw tightened by perhaps a millimeter. Her hands remained flat on the table, but Dalbec, watching from the bar with decades of experience screaming in his chest, saw her fingers shift position. A subtle movement. The kind of adjustment that happens when trained hands are consciously forcing themselves to remain open rather than close into something far more dangerous. "I haven't misrepresented myself to anyone," Sarah said quietly. "Then prove it." Cresswell pulled out his own phone. "Give us your details. We'll verify right now. Should take 2 minutes if you're legit." "I'm not authorized to provide operational details without proper clearance verification," Sinclair whooped. "Operational details. She's actually committing to the story." He panned his camera across the watching crowd. "Everyone hearing this, we've got ourselves a live one. Stolen valor in progress at the Coronado Officers Club." Then Thatcher grabbed Sarah's shoulder. The movement was aggressive, deliberately invasive. He spun her to face him directly, his fingers digging into the muscle above her collarbone with the grip of someone accustomed to physical dominance. "You think you can sit here in our house wearing our symbols, disrespecting real operators, and expect us to let that slide?" For exactly 1 second, something moved behind Sarah Mercer's eyes. It was not fear. It was not anger, at least not the kind that Thatcher would have recognized. It was something older and more precise. A calculation so rapid and so deeply trained that it completed itself before conscious thought could intervene. Threat assessment. Distance to target. Available weapons within reach. Angles of attack. Probability of success. Collateral damage assessment. Dalbec saw it from across the room and pushed away from the bar, immediately recognizing a response pattern he'd witnessed in actual combat veterans hundreds of times. The woman was not panicking. She was targeting. But Sarah didn't move. She didn't strike. She didn't even pull away from Thatcher's grip. She simply looked at him with an expression so completely devoid of fear that several observers would later describe it as the most unsettling thing they'd ever witnessed. "Take your hand off me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Thatcher squeezed harder. "Or what you going to call the cops, lady? We are the cops here. And you just confessed to impersonating?" His words died as the chain around Sarah's neck snapped under the pressure of his grip. The dog tags scattered. Metal clinked against polished wood floor. The challenge coin bounced once, twice, and came to rest near Thatcher's boot. Sarah's hand moved. Later, 3 separate witnesses would describe the motion independently, and all 3 accounts agreed on one detail. They couldn't actually see her hand move. One moment it was on the table. The next moment her fingers were closed around a dog tag that she'd caught in midair. The speed was so far beyond normal human reaction time that several people blinked, certain they'd missed something. But the coin was already on the ground. Thatcher bent to pick it up. His expression was triumphant, now the grin of a hunter who'd cornered his quarry and was savoring the moment before the kill. "Well, well, let's see what kind of souvenir you bought yourself." He held the coin up to the light, squinting at the markings with the casual arrogance of someone who had already reached his conclusion and was merely looking for confirmation. The metal was worn, clearly not new. One side bore an image he didn't recognize, a trident but stylized differently than the standard seal insignia. The design was unfamiliar, and that unfamiliarity should have been his first warning. It wasn't. He flipped the coin. The reverse side showed a series of numbers and letters etched with a precision that suggested machine tooling rather than commercial manufacturing. GU7-041201, Thatcher read aloud, his voice carrying across the silent bar. At a table 12 feet away, Lieutenant Colonel Harding Wolcott set down his glass. The Marine liaison officer had been observing the confrontation with the patient attention of someone who'd spent 30 years reading situations before they fully developed. His weathered face, which had maintained an expression of mild professional interest throughout the exchange, underwent a transformation so sudden and so complete that the officer sitting beside him would later say it was like watching a mask fall off. Wolcott stood. He didn't push his chair back. He didn't excuse himself to his tablemates. He simply rose and walked toward the nearest exit with the controlled urgency of someone who needed to make a phone call that could not wait another 30 seconds. No one noticed him leave. Every eye in the room was fixed on the confrontation at the corner table. "What's this supposed to be?" Thatcher waved the coin. "Some kind of serial number you made up. Some website where you custom order these things." Sarah stood slowly. The movement was controlled but carried an inevitability that made Cresswell take an involuntary step backward. "Give that back." "I don't think so." Thatcher dropped the coin into his breast pocket with theatrical finality. "This is evidence. Evidence that you're running a scam. And now we're calling the MPs." He pulled out his phone. "Let them figure out what federal charges to file." Joey Bramwell, the bartender, spoke up from behind the bar. The former Navy corpsman had been watching the confrontation with a growing unease that he couldn't quite articulate. Something about the woman's bearing, about the way she held herself, triggered instincts from his own years of service that his conscious mind hadn't fully processed. "Hey, Thatcher, maybe ease up a little. Let her explain before this gets out of hand." "Explain what? How she bought fake gear and thought she'd impress real operators?" Thatcher was already dialing. "Captain Faulkner's going to love this one." As Thatcher made his call, Sinclair continued his narration, panning his camera slowly across the room to capture every face, every reaction, every recording phone pointed at the woman who stood motionless in the center of a tightening circle. This is what stolen valor looks like, people. Someone so desperate for respect that she'll steal the identity of warriors who actually earned it. Right here at Coronado, and she picked literally the worst possible night to try this. Cresswell circled Sarah with the predatory patience of someone who'd learned intimidation from people who practiced it professionally. "You know what the penalty is for impersonating a military officer, federal crime. Prison time. Your life just got real complicated." Sarah said nothing. She simply stood there, and as the seconds passed, her posture shifted into what Dalbec, now pushing through the gathering crowd with increasing urgency, recognized as a modified parade rest. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands loosely clasped behind her back. Weight evenly distributed. It was the stance of someone who had stood through countless inspections, briefings, and waiting periods in places far more demanding than a bar in California. It was the stance of someone who'd worn a uniform for years. Dalbec reached the inner edge of the circle. "Gentlemen, maybe we should all take a step back here. Thatcher, you've made your point. Let's wait for the MPS and let them handle it properly. With respect, Master Chief, this doesn't concern you. We caught her red-handed. Caught her doing what exactly? Sitting quietly at a table. Wearing military identification she didn't earn. Did she tell you she was a SEAL?" The question stopped Thatcher for just a moment, a hairline crack in the certainty he wore like armor. "She implied it. She was wearing tags, carrying a coin, talked about attending an operator's memorial." "All of which could be true," Dalbec said calmly. "Did she specifically claim to be something she's not?" "She said her service record is classified," Cresswell interjected. "Classic faker move." Dalbec looked at Sarah. She met his gaze with that same unsettling calm. He saw something in her eyes that he recognized. Not deception, not the nervous energy of someone caught in a lie. Something deeper. The look of a person who was enduring a situation they'd been trained to endure, with the patience of someone who understood that endurance was sometimes the only weapon available. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "Prior service? Yes. Branch? Navy." Dalbec nodded slowly. He wanted to ask more. Wanted to push past the barrier that he could feel separating this woman from the room full of people judging her. But before he could form his next question, the main door of the officers' club crashed open with enough force to silence the remaining conversations. Captain Judith Faulkner strode through the entrance with 4 military police officers at her back. Their sidearms were holstered, but their body language broadcast authority and readiness for confrontation with the practiced ease of people who spent their careers walking into volatile situations. Faulkner was known throughout Coronado for 2 things: her absolute zero tolerance for military misconduct and her ability to make career-ending decisions with the speed and precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. At 43, she carried herself with the compact efficiency of someone who had eliminated every unnecessary movement from her repertoire years ago. Someone want to tell me why I'm here on a Friday night instead of home with my family. Her gaze swept the room like a searchlight before locking onto the knot of people surrounding Sarah. The crowd parted for her the way crowds always parted for Faulkner, not out of courtesy, but out of the instinct that something with sharp edges was passing through. Thatcher stepped forward, his chest expanding with the particular inflation of someone about to deliver what he believed was a righteous report. "Captain, we've identified a stolen valor situation. This woman has been representing herself as military, specifically claiming SEAL service. She's wearing dog tags and carrying military memorabilia she didn't earn. Multiple witnesses present." Faulkner approached Sarah with the measured stride of someone accustomed to people getting out of her way. "Ma'am, I need to see identification, driver's license or military ID." Sarah reached into her back pocket with deliberate slowness. She extracted a wallet and handed over her driver's license. No military identification appeared. Faulkner examined the license under her flashlight, angling it to check the holographic security features with automatic proficiency. Sarah Mercer. Civilian address in San Diego. No military designation. She looked up. "Yet you're wearing dog tags on a military installation." "I attended a memorial service for a fallen operator. I made no claims to anyone about my status." "She absolutely did," Thatcher cut in. "She talked about SEAL training, operational details. I answered questions that were directed at me," Sarah corrected quietly. "I didn't volunteer information." Faulkner raised a hand. The gesture carried enough authority to silence Thatcher mid-sentence. "Ms. Mercer, simple question. Did you represent yourself as a currently serving or former military officer this evening?" "I attended a memorial service." "That's not an answer. Did you or did you not claim military service?" Sarah met Faulkner's eyes. And in that moment, every person watching saw something shift in the air between the two women. Faulkner was authority. She was command structure and regulations and the full weight of military law. And Sarah was something else entirely. Something that didn't flinch from authority because it had operated in spaces where authority was measured not in rank, but in whether you came home alive. "I need to contact Naval Special Warfare Command," Sarah said. "Major General Stephen Greer. This is a matter requiring higher authority involvement." "You don't get to make demands, Ms. Mercer. You're under investigation for federal violations." "With respect, Captain, contact General Greer. He'll verify my status." Thatcher couldn't contain himself. "She's name-dropping a 2-star general now. Captain, this is textbook. She's escalating her story because the smaller lies aren't working." Sergeant First Class Nolan Briggs materialized from the memorial service crowd, with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent his career arriving at exactly the right moment. The Army Ranger had a face that looked like it had been carved from seasoned oak, lines etched by sun and sand, and the particular weathering that comes from decades of service in places where the weather was the least of your concerns. "Captain Faulkner, what specific claims did she make? I've been observing this interaction for the past 15 minutes, and I'd like to understand the factual basis for the accusation." Thatcher's jaw tightened. "She implied she was one of us, walking around with gear talking about operations." "Implied is not the same as claimed," Briggs said. His voice carried the flat, unshakable authority of a man who testified in enough military proceedings to know the precise difference between the two words. "Did she introduce herself as an active duty SEAL? Did she tell anyone she held a specific rank or rate?" Silence. "She wore dog tags," Cresswell insisted, "which could be from a family member, which could be legitimately hers from prior service, which could be completely legal even if they're personal items with no military connection whatsoever." Faulkner's expression hardened. She had not driven across base on a Friday night to moderate a philosophical debate about the definition of impersonation. "Enough. Ms. Mercer, final opportunity. Do you have any documentation of military service discharge papers? D-214. Anything verifiable?" "My service record is classified under executive order. I cannot produce public documentation without authorization from Naval Special Warfare Command." Sinclair burst into laughter. "Perfect. She's fully committed. Captain, this is textbook fake veteran behavior. They always claim their records are sealed or classified when they can't produce proof. Faulkner seemed to agree. Her posture shifted toward conclusion. Ms. Mercer, people with genuinely classified backgrounds don't announce it in public establishments. They don't wear identification items that draw attention, and they don't claim they can't provide basic verification. In my experience, the people who talk about classified service are the ones who don't have any. I made no announcements, Sarah said. Her voice hadn't changed since the beginning. The same measured tone, the same winter steel calm. I attended a private memorial service. These gentlemen approached me, made accusations, and escalated the situation. I've answered your questions within the bounds of my security obligations. The appropriate authority here is me, Faulkner said, and my authority says you're under arrest. She nodded to her MPS. Cuff her. The MPs moved forward. Sarah didn't resist. She turned and placed her hands behind her back with an ease and precision that made every trained person in the room pause. Her wrists aligned perfectly. Her fingers were relaxed. Her weight shifted to accommodate the restraint position with the automatic fluency of muscle memory. She'd been handcuffed before, multiple times, by people who knew what they were doing. Dahlbeck saw it. Briggs saw it. They exchanged a glance across the circle of onlookers that said the same thing without words. Something is very wrong here. Sarah Mercer. Faulkner's voice rose to carry across the entire room. You are under arrest for violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 912, impersonating a military officer. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. I understand my rights, Sarah said. I repeat my request to contact Major General Stephen Greer at Naval Special Warfare Command. This arrest is a mistake that will be corrected once proper verification is completed. Thatcher laughed. The sound was harsh and carried across the bar like a slap. Still trying to name drop even in handcuffs. Captain, this is beautiful. We caught a real one tonight. The MPs began leading Sarah toward the door. The crowd parted. Phones rose like periscopes from a sea of faces. Recording lights blinked in constellations. Sinclair provided running commentary for his growing audience, his voice carrying the particular excitement of someone who believed he was documenting justice. And there she goes, folks. Stolen valor perpetrator getting exactly what she deserves. This is why we stay vigilant. These frauds think they can disrespect the men and women who actually served, but the truth always comes out. Sarah walked with the MPS without resistance, without hurry, without any visible reaction to the phones recording her humiliation or the commentary narrating her supposed downfall. Her spine was straight. Her eyes were forward. Her breathing was controlled. She was enduring. As she passed the bar, Joey Bramwell caught her eye. The former corpsman's face was troubled, his instincts screaming something his conscious mind couldn't quite articulate. But he said nothing. What could he say? The MPs had jurisdiction. The captain had made her call. The system was operating the way systems operate. And then she reached the section of the room where the memorial service attendees had gathered. Mrs. Eleanor Dunn stepped forward from the small group of family members. She was 73 years old. Her white hair was pinned back with the careful attention of someone who believed that how you presented yourself at a memorial service mattered. Her eyes were red from crying, but her back was straight with the dignity of a Gold Star mother who had learned to carry grief the way soldiers carry equipment because there was no choice but to keep moving. Young lady, she called out softly. The MPs paused. Even Faulkner hesitated. Thank you for coming to Marcus's service. It meant a great deal to our family. Sarah's stride broke. It was almost imperceptible, a falter in the rhythm that lasted less than a heartbeat. But for the first time since Thatcher had first approached her table, the controlled mask that Sarah Mercer wore like armor cracked. She looked at the elderly woman, and something raw surfaced behind her eyes. Something that had nothing to do with the arrest, or the accusations, or the phones recording every second. Something far older and far heavier. He was the best of us, ma'am. Sarah's voice trembled. Just once, just barely. I'm sorry for your loss. Thatcher grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Enough with the act. Let's go. And they took her out into the night. Still handcuffed. Still silent. Still carrying whatever secrets lived behind those eyes that had seen more than anyone in that room could imagine. The main door closed behind her. The crowd slowly dispersed back to their tables. The energy that had crackled through the room began to dissipate, replaced by the animated buzz of people processing what they'd witnessed and reaching for their phones to share it. Thatcher bought a round for his friends. Sinclair posted his video with hashtags about stolen valor and justice served. Cresswell began composing notes for the official investigation report. The Officers' Club returned to something resembling normalcy. Drinks were poured, conversations resumed. The incident became the evening's entertainment, a story that would be retold and embellished in the coming days. None of them noticed Dalbeck making a quiet phone call from the far corner of the bar, his weathered face tight with something that looked very much like controlled fury. None of them saw Briggs step outside and type a text message with the careful precision of someone choosing every word deliberately. Situation at Officers' Club. Wrongful arrest of potential classified operator. Need higher authority verification immediately. None of them knew that Wolcott had reached Major General Stephen Greer 14 minutes ago, and that Greer, who had been attending a retirement dinner for Admiral Patterson across town, had excused himself from the table before dessert was served. And none of them understood that the challenge coin sitting in Thatcher's breast pocket, the one with those strange markings and that sequence of numbers he'd read aloud to a room full of recording phones, was about to transform from evidence of fraud into proof of the most catastrophic error in judgment that anyone present had ever committed. Because while they celebrated their righteous bust, Sarah Mercer was being led into a windowless office in the military police station. The metal chair was deliberately uncomfortable. The walls displayed motivational posters about integrity and justice, oblivious to the irony of their presence during false accusations. She sat with her hands cuffed behind her back, her posture still perfect, her breathing still controlled, and waited. She waited because waiting was what operators did when every other option had been removed. You controlled what you could control. You endured what you couldn't. And you trusted that somewhere someone with the right clearance and the right authority was doing what needed to be done. The video of her arrest had passed 100,000 views. And climbing. The military police station smelled the way every institutional building smelled when it had been cleaned by people who followed regulations about maintenance more faithfully than regulations about due process. Stale coffee. Industrial cleaner. The faint chemical residue of floor wax applied without enthusiasm or deviation from protocol. Sarah cataloged the room without moving her eyes. Metal desk bolted to the floor. 2 chairs on the interrogator's side, 1 on hers. A digital recorder on the desk. Red light steady, already running. A 2-way mirror set into the east wall that reflected back a woman in handcuffs who looked remarkably unconcerned about being in handcuffs. Her wrists ached where the cuffs bit into skin. She shifted her weight slightly to redistribute pressure across her shoulders. The movement was practiced efficient, the kind of micro-adjustment that comes from experience with prolonged restraint in positions far less comfortable than a chair in an air-conditioned office. She'd been sitting for 11 minutes when the door opened. Commander Richard Keene entered first. The base JAG officer carried himself with the precise confidence of a man who had built his career on the belief that military law was a perfect system operated by imperfect people, and that his job was to close the gap between the two. At 45, his uniform was immaculate, his posture impeccable, and his expression conveyed the particular weariness of someone who'd been pulled away from his Friday evening to deal with what he assumed was a straightforward case of civilian misconduct. He carried a yellow legal pad, a government-issue pen, and the absolute certainty that this interrogation would be brief. Behind him came Captain Faulkner, her jaw set with the rigid determination of someone defending a decision she'd already committed to publicly. Lieutenant Thatcher followed, positioning himself against the far wall with his arms crossed, and the satisfied expression of a hunter watching his trophy get mounted. Last through the door was Sergeant First Class Nolan Briggs. The Army Ranger had not been invited. He had simply followed the group from the Officers' Club with the quiet persistence of a man who understood that his presence might be the only thing standing between this woman and an injustice that would be difficult to undo once completed. Faulkner glanced at him. "Sergeant, this is a Navy matter." "With respect, Captain, I'm a witness to the events in question. Proper procedure allows for neutral observation during preliminary interrogation. I'd like to stay." Faulkner's eyes narrowed, but Keene waved a hand. "Let him stay. The more witnesses, the stronger our case." He settled into the chair across from Sarah, placed his legal pad on the desk, and uncapped his pen with the ceremonial precision of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. "Ms. Mercer, I'm Commander Keene, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I'll be conducting the preliminary investigation into charges filed against you this evening. Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. He paused for effect, a technique he'd refined over hundreds of interrogations. Cooperation works in your favor. Stolen valor is a serious federal offense, but first-time offenders who demonstrate genuine remorse frequently receive reduced sentencing. Do you understand? Sarah looked at him the way she might look at a weather report, with acknowledgement but without particular concern. I understand. Good. Let's start with the basics. Full name: Sarah Ann Mercer. Date of birth: November 15, 1989. Current occupation: emergency medical technician, San Diego County Fire and Rescue. Keene made notes with careful strokes. Each letter formed precisely each line of text aligned with the ruled margins of his pad. He was building a record. Every answer documented. Every inconsistency cataloged for future reference. And you claim prior military service? I served in the United States Navy. Honorably discharged October 2013. See. From the wall, Thatcher made a sound that fell somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Here we go. Let's hear the details of this alleged service. Keene shot him a look that carried enough authority to peel paint. Lieutenant, I'm conducting this interview. You will have an opportunity to provide your statement afterward. Until then, you will remain silent, or you will leave this room. Am I clear? Thatcher's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Keene returned his attention to Sarah. Ms. Mercer, what was your rate in the Navy? Sarah was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Not the hesitation of someone fabricating a story. The pause of someone measuring a response against boundaries that the people in this room didn't know existed. I'm not authorized to disclose my specific rate or unit designation without clearance verification from Naval Special Warfare Command. Thatcher's body lurched forward from the wall, his restraint crumbling. The classic deflection, sir. This is exactly... Keene raised a hand without looking at him. The gesture was enough. Thatcher subsided, but his face had gone the particular shade of red that indicated the silence wouldn't last. Ms. Mercer, I hold a secret-level security clearance. If your service involves classification at that level, you're authorized to disclose it to me. My service requires clearance above secret commander. The room changed. It was not a visible change. No one moved. No one spoke. But the air seemed to compress as if the walls had drawn half an inch closer. Keene's pen stopped its careful movement across the pad. His eyes lifted from the paper to study Sarah's face with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Top secret, sensitive, compartmented information. Special access programs. These were designations that most military personnel encountered only as concepts in security briefings. They described a world that existed parallel to the conventional military. A world of operations that didn't appear in official records units, that didn't appear on organizational charts, and personnel who didn't appear in any database accessible through normal channels. Briggs spoke quietly from his position near the door. Commander, that would indicate top secret SCI or compartmented program involvement. If she's telling the truth, standard verification procedures won't apply. If she's telling the truth, Thatcher emphasized. Biggest if in the history of if, Sergeant. Keene tapped his pen against the pad 3 times, a thinking rhythm, a habit he'd developed during law school and never broken. Fine, let's approach this differently. He set the pen down and leaned back. Ms. Mercer, tell me about BUD/S training, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Qualification Course. Assuming you're claiming familiarity. I haven't claimed familiarity with BUD/S. But you know what it is? Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, conducted at the Naval Special Warfare Center, Coronado, California. Duration approximately 6 months, divided into 3 phases. First phase focuses on physical conditioning and water competency. Second phase covers combat diving. Third phase covers land warfare. Common knowledge, Thatcher muttered. You can find that on the first page of any internet search. Keene continued, his questions becoming more specific, more technical, designed to probe beyond the surface-level information available to anyone with a browser and curiosity. What week of BUD/S is Hell Week? Week 4, first phase. Describe the grinder. Physical training area. Asphalt surface approximately 150 by 200 feet. Used for PT Evolution's log PT conditioning drills. Adjacent to the first phase barracks. Keene's eyebrows shifted. a millimeter of movement that on his controlled face represented significant surprise. The dimensions were not standard public information. They were the kind of detail that lived in the muscle memory of people who had crawled across that surface until their elbows bled. What happens during surf torture? Students form boat crews in the surf zone. They're required to link arms and remain in the water for extended periods. Water temperature typically ranges between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit depending on season. The purpose is psychological endurance testing and team cohesion under extreme physical stress. How long are the immersion periods? Variable, determined by instructor assessment of class performance and individual tolerance thresholds. There's no standardized duration. I've seen sessions run from 20 minutes to over 2 hours. The final sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread outward through every person present. I've seen sessions. Not I've read about. Not I've heard. I've seen. Briggs leaned forward slightly. His eyes had narrowed to the particular focus of someone who just heard confirmation of something he'd already suspected. She's not reciting, he said quietly. She's not pulling from memorized material. Listen to the way she qualifies her answers. Variable, depending on assessment. She's describing what she experienced, not what she studied. That's your opinion, Thatcher said. But something had shifted in his voice. The absolute certainty that had carried him through the evening like a tailwind had developed its first cross-current of doubt. Keene studied Sarah for a long moment. Then he reached his decision. He was going to ask the question that would settle this one way or another. Ms. Mercer, what weapons platforms are standard issue for SEAL assault elements? Sarah understood what was happening. She could see the trap as clearly as if it had been drawn on a whiteboard. Answer truthfully and reveal knowledge that no civilian should possess. Refuse and confirm their belief that she was a fraud with nothing to back up her claims. But there was a third dimension to the calculation that Keene hadn't considered. Military regulations governing interrogation by legal authority were explicit. When a service member, active or former, was subjected to formal questioning by a JAG officer in connection with potential criminal charges, truthful responses were not optional. They were required. Sarah had taken an oath. The oath didn't have an expiration date. She made her choice. Standard loadout for development group assault elements typically includes the modified Heckler & Koch 416 with 10.4-inch barrel suppressor ready configuration. Optics package centers on the EOTech EXPS3 holographic sight with magnifier option. Aiming systems include visible and infrared laser designators. Sidearm is the Glock 19 with modified grip and extended magazine, though some operators maintain personal preference for the Sig Sauer P226. Breaching elements carry additional specialized tools depending on target structure assessment. Stop. Keene's voice cut through the room like a blade. His pen had fallen from his fingers at some point during her answer. It lay on the legal pad, a thin line of ink bleeding into the yellow paper where the tip rested. He didn't pick it up. His hands were flat on the desk surface, and for the first time since entering the room, Commander Richard Keene looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on ground far less solid than he'd assumed. Where did you get that information? Sarah fell silent. Where did you get it? Thatcher pushed off the wall, his voice stripped of triumph, and replaced with something closer to alarm. That's not public. Those specifications are not available to civilians. No, Keene said quietly. His voice had dropped to a register that the people in this room had never heard from him before. They're not. Ms. Mercer, you just disclosed classified weapons configuration data. Operational specifications that are restricted under multiple security directives. He stared at her across the metal desk. The recorder's red eye watched without blinking. How do you know those details? I was asked a direct question by military legal authority, Sarah said. I'm required to answer honestly. That doesn't explain how a civilian EMT from San Diego possesses classified weapons data. It does, Sarah said. If my access to that information came through legitimate service. The room fractured. Thatcher demanded immediate arrest for espionage. His voice cracked on the word, the sound of certainty collapsing under its own weight. Faulkner wanted to know who Sarah's contacts were, what intelligence networks she'd accessed, who had provided her with classified material. Briggs stood motionless by the door, watching the chaos, with the expression of a man who had found exactly what he'd expected to find, and took no pleasure in being right. Keene raised both hands. The gesture took several seconds to achieve its intended effect, but gradually the room quieted. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone choosing each word the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Ms. Mercer, I'm going to ask you one direct question, and I require a direct answer. Not deflection, not claims of classification, not evasion. He paused. Were you or were you not a member of the United States Naval Special Warfare Community? Sarah met his eyes. Whatever she saw there, whatever she calculated about the man sitting across from her, and the consequences of the words she was about to speak, it took her less than a second to decide. I was. In what capacity? That information requires top-secret SCI clearance and compartmented access authorization that I cannot verify you possess, Commander. You have legal authority over this proceeding, but you may not have the need-to-know clearance for specific programs in which I participated. Keene stood. His chair scraped across the concrete floor with a sound like tearing metal. He paced to the far wall and back, his legal mind working through implications at a speed that his body couldn't match. This is untenable. You claim military service. You demonstrate classified knowledge, but you're not in any system I can access, and you refuse to provide details I can verify through standard channels. I've provided details, Commander. You're now aware that I possess classified weapons specifications. That knowledge wasn't obtained illegally. I didn't hack a database or steal documents. I knew those configurations because I used those weapon systems, carried them, maintained them, fired them in conditions that I am not authorized to describe. Faulkner stepped forward. Her approach had shifted from accusatory to something more complex. The certainty that had driven her to order the arrest was cracking, and through the cracks something uncomfortable was seeping in. Ms. Mercer, show me your hands. Sarah looked at her. The request seemed incongruent, but after a moment she extended her cuffed hands, palms upward, into the cone of light cast by the desk lamp. Faulkner took Sarah's wrists and turned them slowly, examining the hands beneath the fluorescent glare. Her thumbs traced across the skin with the practiced attention of someone conducting a physical assessment. What she found made her stop. The calluses were not normal. Thick ridges ran across the base of each finger, concentrated on the web between thumb and index finger of the right hand. The pattern was specific, unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around people who handled weapons professionally. These were not the calluses of a recreational shooter who visited a range on weekends. This was the dense, layered scarring that developed from carrying and firing a service weapon daily for years in conditions that went far beyond controlled environments. Between the thumb and forefinger of her right hand, a pronounced scar traced a line that Briggs identified from across the room. Slide bite, he said, moving closer. That's the scarring pattern from improper grip on a 1911 platform or similar heavy slide pistol. Early training injury. She learned to shoot on something that punishes you when you hold it wrong, and she learned fast enough that the scar is clean. One injury, one correction, never repeated. Anyone can go to shooting ranges, Thatcher said. But the words came out thin, like paper held up to light. Not like this. Briggs shook his head, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone stating facts that were not open for debate. This is duty weapon wear, Lieutenant. This is what happens when you carry a sidearm 18 hours a day in operational environments for years. Recreational shooters don't develop this pattern. Weekend warriors don't develop this pattern. This is the hand of someone who was issued a weapon, carried it as part of their daily existence, and used it enough to reshape the bone structure beneath the skin. Keene examined the hands as well. The legal implications were multiplying in his mind like compound interest, each new piece of evidence adding weight to a conclusion he wasn't prepared to reach. Ms. Mercer, remove your jacket. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. A door that had been held closed was about to be forced open. I'd prefer not to. It wasn't a request. You're under arrest and subject to physical examination relevant to the investigation. Remove the jacket or I'll direct the MPs to do it. Sarah held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she slowly pulled off the light denim jacket, working it over the handcuffs with the awkward efficiency of someone who dealt with similar restrictions before. The jacket dropped to the floor, revealing a short-sleeved gray shirt beneath. Her forearms told their own story. Running up her left arm from wrist to elbow, a series of thin scars created a pattern that made Briggs draw in a sharp breath through his teeth. The scars were not uniform. They radiated outward from a central point on her inner forearm, in irregular lines of varying length and depth. Some barely visible, others thick enough to catch shadows under the overhead light. Shrapnel, Briggs said. His voice had gone quiet. That's a blast pattern. IED or explosive device fragmentation. Multiple entry points from a single detonation source. The fragment spread is consistent with the device that detonated within 15 to 20 feet of her position. He pointed to her left shoulder, where the sleeve of her t-shirt couldn't quite conceal the edge of a scar that extended from her collarbone toward her back. And that scarring is surgical. Something under that skin required significant medical intervention. Plates, pins, reconstruction of some kind. The incision pattern suggests military surgical protocol. Clean entry, minimal scarring relative to the repair. Whoever operated on her was very good, and they were working in a facility with resources. Faulkner stared at the scars. Her face had gone through a transformation that she was not yet fully aware of the slow collapse of a position that had seemed unassailable 30 minutes ago. "These aren't fresh," she said. "Years old, healed cleanly." "Military medical care," Briggs confirmed. "Field surgery followed by extended rehabilitation at a facility capable of reconstructive orthopedic work. This wasn't a car accident patched up at a civilian emergency room." "Could be from anything." Thatcher's voice came from the wall where he still stood, but the words carried no conviction. They were the verbal equivalent of a man gripping a ledge with his fingertips holding on to a position that gravity had already won. "Industrial accident, car crash." "With shrapnel pattern." Briggs turned to look at him, and the expression on the ranger's face held something that went beyond professional disagreement. "Lieutenant, I have personally treated and evacuated service members with exactly these wounds. I have carried men and women whose bodies bore exactly these scars. That is a combat injury signature. I would stake my career on it." The silence that followed lasted long enough for the overhead lights to flicker once. Keene returned to his chair. When he sat down, his entire approach had shifted. The prosecutorial certainty was gone, replaced by the cautious methodology of someone who had realized he might be standing on the wrong side of an equation that could not be easily rebalanced. He pulled out a laptop from a case beneath the desk, logged into a secure terminal, and began typing Sarah's information into the military personnel database. His fingers moved with rapid precision, navigating systems he'd used thousands of times before. Sarah watched him work. Her expression hadn't changed throughout the physical examination. She had endured the exposure of her scars, the analysis of her injuries, the clinical dissection of her body's evidence with the same composure she'd maintained since the moment Thatcher had first approached her table at the officers' club. But Briggs, standing close enough to see her eyes, noticed something that no one else did. Her pupils had dilated slightly when the scars were exposed. Not from the light, from something internal. A memory, perhaps, or several memories returning uninvited through doors she'd spent years learning to keep closed. Keene worked for 5 minutes. The only sounds were keystrokes and the recorder's silent observation. Finally, he looked up. No results. No record of Sarah Mercer in the SEAL Pipeline BUD/S graduation records or Naval Special Warfare Community databases accessible through my clearance level. Thatcher's expression reignited. The relief that flooded his features was almost physical. A man pulled back from the edge of a cliff he'd been slowly sliding toward. There it is. She's not in the system. All this classified nonsense, all the weapon specs and scar stories, and she doesn't exist in any military database. She's a fraud, sir. An elaborate one, maybe the best I've ever seen, but a fraud. "She's not in the databases you can access," Briggs corrected. His voice carried no heat, no emphasis, just the quiet precision of someone stating a mathematical truth. "That's a different statement than she doesn't exist in any database. What databases can't a JAG commander with secret clearance access? Quite a few, Lieutenant. JSOC personnel records, special mission unit rosters, compartmented program files. If she was part of an operation above the commander's clearance level, she wouldn't appear in any search he runs. Not because the records don't exist, but because his authorization doesn't reach the shelf they're stored on." Keene closed the laptop harder than necessary. The sound punctuated the argument like a gavel. "Ms. Mercer, I'll be direct. You've demonstrated knowledge that should not be in civilian hands. You carry physical evidence consistent with combat service and weapons training at a professional level. But you don't exist in any system I can verify. That leaves exactly 2 possibilities." He held up one finger. "You're telling the truth about classified service at levels above my access, in which case this arrest is a catastrophic error." A second finger. "Or you've obtained classified information through illegal means, and constructed an elaborate false identity, in which case we're dealing with something far more serious than stolen valor. I've told you the truth, Commander. Then give me someone who can confirm it. A commanding officer, a unit member, someone I can contact tonight who will verify your claims. Major General Stephen Greer, Commanding General Naval Special Warfare Command. Thatcher's voice came out strangled. She's still trying to name-drop a 2-star. Commander, that would be my last commanding officer, Sarah said quietly. The words fell into the room with a weight that seemed to press the air from every corner. Keene rubbed his temples. Ms. Mercer, if you truly reported to General Greer, he would maintain records of your service. He does. Then why aren't they in the standard databases? Because it wasn't standard service, Commander. A knock interrupted the circular argument. One of the MPs opened the door and leaned in. Commander, there's an NCIS agent requesting involvement. Says this case falls under federal investigative jurisdiction. Special Agent Dana Whitfield entered the room the way a scalpel enters an operating theater. Precise. Purposeful. Without any movement that wasn't absolutely necessary. At 36, she carried the authority of someone who'd investigated cases ranging from petty larceny to matters of national security, and whose face had been trained to reveal exactly as much as she intended, and nothing more. Her eyes swept the room in a single pass. Keene, Faulkner, Thatcher, Briggs, and the woman in handcuffs whose posture and bearing had already told Whitfield more than the preliminary report she'd been handed in the hallway. Then her gaze found the challenge coin sitting on Keene's desk, where it had been placed as evidence. She picked it up, turned it over. Her fingers traced the engravings. The non-standard trident, the alphanumeric code, the wear pattern on the metal that spoke of years carried close to the body. Her expression didn't change, not by any measurable amount, but her posture underwent a subtle transformation. She went still, the particular stillness of someone who has just encountered something they recognize from a world that most people don't know exists. Where did you get this? She asked Sarah. It was issued to me, May 2011. For what? Operation 041. Whitfield's fingers tightened around the coin. The movement was nearly invisible, a contraction of perhaps 2 millimeters, but it was the loudest thing that had happened in that room since Keene had told Sarah to stop talking about weapons. Commander Keene, I need everyone out of this room except essential investigative personnel. Now! Thatcher erupted. I identified the suspect. I have a right to be present during... You have no rights in an NCIS investigation, Lieutenant. Whitfield's voice could have frozen running water. You are a witness and a potential subject of a separate inquiry. You will leave this room immediately, or I will have you removed and add obstruction of a federal investigation to the list of things we'll be discussing in the coming days. The color drained from Thatcher's face in stages. He looked at Keene for support. Keene was studying Whitfield with the expression of a man reassessing his position in a chess game he thought he was winning. Lieutenant, Captain, please step outside. Faulkner's departure was controlled professional, the retreat of someone who recognized superior jurisdiction and understood that resistance would only compound whatever damage had already been done. Thatcher followed her out, but the look he cast toward Sarah as he passed carried something new. Not triumph, not anger. The first pale stirrings of fear. The door closed. The room held 4 people now. Keene, Briggs, Whitfield, and Sarah. Whitfield sat down across from Sarah, placed the challenge coin between them on the desk, and opened a laptop that connected to systems with classification headers that Keene had never seen in his career. She typed rapidly her keystrokes, carrying the fluency of someone who navigated these databases regularly. The silence stretched. 5 minutes. 7. 10. The recorder watched with its unblinking red eye. Whitfield closed the laptop. When she looked up, her face held an expression that Keene would later describe as the most controlled anger he'd ever witnessed. Commander, how much do you know about Naval Special Warfare Group 7? There is no Group 7, Keene said automatically. The response was reflexive, drawn from his comprehensive knowledge of the Naval Special Warfare organizational structure. NSW is organized into Groups 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, and 10. There is no Group 7 designation. Correct. There is no Group 7, officially. Whitfield turned to Sarah. Something passed between the two women. A recognition that had nothing to do with personal acquaintance, and everything to do with shared knowledge of a world that operated beneath the surface of the world everyone else inhabited. But there was a unit with that designation. Wasn't there Ms. Mercer? Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Briggs, standing close enough to read the micro-expressions that training couldn't fully suppress, saw her shoulders tighten. A fraction of movement. The involuntary response of someone hearing a name spoken aloud that they'd carried in silence for over a decade. "I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of classified units," Sarah said carefully. "No, you can't." Whitfield nodded. "But I can because I have the clearance." She turned to Keene, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of information that was about to change everything that had happened in this room and everything that would happen after. "Commander, Ms. Mercer is telling the truth. Her service record is classified at levels that exceed your access authorization, my access authorization, and the access authorization of every person on this base except one. The challenge coin on this desk is authentic. It was issued under protocols that I can verify but cannot discuss in this setting." She paused. "You need to release her. Immediately. And you need to contact Major General Greer before this situation escalates into an incident that will end careers, starting with yours." Keene stared at her. The legal pad in front of him, covered in careful notes documenting what he'd believed was a straightforward case of civilian fraud, suddenly looked like a confession written in his own handwriting. The door opened. Thatcher stood in the hallway. He'd been watching through the two-way mirror, or someone had told him. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was moving towards Sarah with an expression that couldn't decide between fury and disbelief, and as he passed through the doorway, his shoulder connected with hers. The contact was deliberate. A final act of contempt from a man whose world was collapsing and who needed to assert dominance over something, anything, even if it was just a shoulder check against a handcuffed woman. The impact drove Sarah against the edge of the metal desk. Her shirt sleeve caught on a protruding bolt head. The fabric tore with a soft sound like a page being pulled from a book, and her shoulder was exposed. The tattoo was impossible to miss. A Navy SEAL trident rendered in sharp black lines with exceptional detail. But it was not the standard trident that every SEAL wore on their uniform and carried with pride. This trident was different. Below the eagle and anchor and pistol, where the standard insignia ended, additional elements continued. The letters GU7 in a font that matched military stencil specifications, and surrounding those letters, 12 five-pointed stars arranged in a precise circle, each one identical, each one representing something that the people staring at the tattoo were only beginning to comprehend. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Joey Bramwell, who had followed the crowd from the officers' club and was standing in the hallway watching through the open door, went pale. The color left his face the way light leaves a room when someone hits the switch. His lips moved. The words came out barely above a whisper, but in the silence they carried to every ear. "That's a ghost unit designation?" Dalbeck arrived in the hallway at that moment, pushing past the bartender with the urgency of a man who'd been making phone calls for the past 45 minutes and had just received answers that confirmed his worst fears. He saw the tattoo through the open door. His entire body went rigid, every muscle locked into a position that 22 years of service had burned into his nervous system. He came to attention. Not the casual attention of a daily formation. The full, formal, absolute attention of a military professional recognizing something that demanded every ounce of respect his body could physically express. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was thick, roughened by something that had nothing to do with the bourbon he'd been drinking an hour ago. "That is not something to be taken lightly." Ura pulled her torn shirt back over her shoulder, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen it. Everyone in that hallway, in that room, pressed against that two-way mirror. The image was already searing itself into memories that would carry it forward for years. Then from the far end of the corridor, a door opened. Not slowly, not tentatively. The door opened the way doors open when someone on the other side has decided that whatever is happening behind it has gone on long enough. Footsteps. Multiple sets. Moving with the synchronized purpose of people who'd spent careers walking in formation. And a voice. A single voice cutting through the hallway with an authority that had been forged over 3 decades of command in the most demanding operational environments the United States military had ever created. "Where is she?" Major General Stephen Greer entered the military police station the way a force of nature enters a room. Not with violence, but with an inevitability that made everything else in the space rearrange itself around his presence. He wore his dress uniform, every ribbon in precise alignment, every metal catching the light with the muted gleam of metal that had been earned in places most Americans would never hear about. At 58, he moved with the efficiency of someone half his age. Each step calibrated, each movement purposeful. The physical vocabulary of a man who had spent 30 years in special operations and had never learned to waste energy on anything that didn't matter. Behind him came Commander Bill Hodges, the base commander, whose expression carried the particular discomfort of a man who'd been pulled from his home on a Friday night and briefed on a situation that was going to generate paperwork measured in pounds rather than pages. Behind Hodges came Lieutenant Colonel Harding Wolcott, the Marine liaison who'd made the phone call 90 minutes ago that had set this moment in motion. His weathered face showed nothing. He'd done what needed doing. The rest was above his pay grade. The hallway erupted. Everyone who could stand came to attention. It was involuntary, the response of military bodies to the presence of stars on a collar that could determine the trajectory of every career within a 100-foot radius. Keene shot from his chair so fast that his legal pad scattered to the floor. Faulkner snapped to rigid attention, her hand trembling at her side. Thatcher, who'd been standing in the hallway with the stunned expression of someone watching a building collapse in slow motion, straightened with a jolt that looked almost painful. Even Sarah, handcuffs still locked behind her back, began to rise from her chair. Greer's eyes swept the scene. He took in everything. The torn shirt, the exposed tattoo, the handcuffs catching light as Sarah shifted in the metal chair. The challenge coin on Keene's desk, sitting on top of a yellow legal pad covered in notes that would need to be classified and sealed before sunrise. The faces in the hallway ranging from confusion to fear, to the particular expression that appears on people who are realizing slowly, and with growing horror, that they have made a mistake from which there is no clean recovery. He saw all of it. And then he looked at Sarah. Really looked at her. The way you look at someone you haven't seen in years, but never stop thinking about. The way you look at someone whose file sits in a locked drawer in your office next to 11 other files that represent the most extraordinary soldiers you've ever commanded and the heaviest secrets you've ever carried. His expression moved through emotions the way weather moves across open water. Shock first, then recognition, then something that lived in the space between pain and relief, a territory familiar to anyone who has lost people in service, and then found one of them alive in an unexpected place. His jaw tightened. His shoulders squared, though they were already square. And then, Major General Stephen Greer, Commanding General of Naval Special Warfare Command, 2-star flag officer with authority over every SEAL team in the United States Navy, did something that would be analyzed and discussed in hushed conversations across Coronado for years to come. He came to attention, and he saluted her. A handcuffed woman in a torn gray t-shirt and jeans sitting in a metal chair in an MP station, and a general in full dress uniform rendering the formal military salute that protocol reserved for those who had earned the highest respect the armed forces could bestow. "Operator Mercer," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, carrying the kind of weight that only comes from words spoken by someone who understands exactly what they mean. "It's an honor." The room ceased to function. Thatcher's face lost its color so completely that his skin appeared translucent under the light. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Beside him, Sinclair, who'd followed the commotion from the officers' club with his phone still in hand, dropped the device. It hit the tile floor with a crack that no one heard, because no one was listening to anything except the impossible silence that followed a general's salute to a prisoner. Cresswell backed into the wall behind him, as if the wall might open up and let him disappear into the building's infrastructure. Faulkner's hands shook at her sides, with a tremor she couldn't control. Keene sat down. Not deliberately. His legs simply stopped supporting his weight, and the chair happened to be where he landed. Sarah couldn't return the salute. Her hands were locked behind her back in restraints that had been applied by people who were now watching their careers dissolve in real time. But she met Greer's eyes, and for the first time since Thatcher had approached her table at the officers' club, the controlled mask she'd maintained through 90 minutes of accusation and humiliation cracked. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical collapse that movies would have demanded. Just a softening around the eyes. A slight tremor at the corner of her mouth. The nearly imperceptible breakdown of a barrier that had been holding back everything she'd carried through the evening. Through the years. Through the silence that had been the price of her service. "General?" Her voice was steady. Almost. "Permission to speak freely." "Granted." "It's good to see you, sir." Something moved across Greer's face. A fracture in his own composure that he repaired almost instantly, but not before every person in the room witnessed it. The general who commanded the most elite special operations forces in the world had just shown for one unguarded moment that he was human. "The honor is mine, Sarah. Always has been." He turned to Faulkner. The warmth vanished from his expression, replaced by something cold and precise and absolutely devoid of mercy. "Get those handcuffs off her. Now!" Faulkner moved forward, fumbling for her keys. Her hands were shaking so severely that the metal key rattled against the cuff housing 3 times before finding the lock. The mechanism clicked open. The cuffs fell away. Sarah brought her hands forward and rubbed her wrists. The movement was automatic, unconscious, the habit of someone who'd felt restraints removed enough times that the response required no thought. Red marks circled both wrists where the metal had pressed against skin for over an hour. Greer watched her rub her wrists. His jaw tightened further. Then he turned to address the room. Every person present understood with the instinct that military personnel develop for recognizing the moment before consequences fall, that what came next would be delivered without qualification, without mercy, and without any possibility of appeal. "For those present with appropriate clearance, I am about to provide information that does not leave this room. For those without clearance." His eyes found Thatcher and held him with a gaze that could have cut through armor plating. "Consider this an official briefing under national security protocols. Any disclosure of what you hear in the next 5 minutes will be prosecuted under federal law. Am I understood?" A murmur of acknowledgement moved through the room. Greer picked up the challenge coin from Keene's desk. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, turning it so the markings caught the light. The trident on one side, the code on the other. 12 years of silence contained in a circle of worn metal. This coin was issued to 12 individuals who participated in the most highly classified naval special warfare operations conducted between 2009 and 2013. These individuals served in a unit that has no official designation, no organizational chart, no entry in any public or standard military database. They operated in denied territories where United States military presence could not be acknowledged by any branch of government. They conducted missions under conditions of absolute secrecy, and they did so with a success rate and casualty ratio that remains unmatched in the history of special operations. He paused. The room was so silent that the electrical hum of the overhead lights sounded like engines. Petty Officer First Class Sarah Mercer served in that unit from 2009 to 2013. She was an explosive ordnance breacher and combat medic. She deployed to 4 operational theaters. She participated in 17 classified operations. He set the coin down on the desk. The click of metal on metal was the loudest sound in the world, including Operation Neptune Spear. May 2, 2011. Someone in the hallway gasped, a sharp intake of breath that carried the shock of sudden comprehension. The words Neptune Spear didn't require explanation. Not in this building, not on this base, not to anyone who had worn a uniform in the last 15 years. The Bin Laden raid. She was on the Bin Laden raid. The voice came from the hallway. Bramwell, the former corpsman who'd watched Sarah's arrest with growing unease and said nothing because he'd had no evidence to support his instincts. Now he pressed his hand against the wall, as if he needed it to keep standing. Thatcher's voice emerged from somewhere in the wreckage of his conviction, broken, barely audible. But there were no women on that mission. Greer turned to look at him. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried with it the full weight of a 2-star general's authority directed at a lieutenant who had committed errors that would take years to fully catalog. Officially, Lieutenant, there were no women. The word officially hung in the air with the particular resonance of a word that means one thing on paper and something entirely different in the places where paper doesn't go. Operator Mercer's participation in Neptune Spear remains classified under executive order, as does the existence of her unit, its operational history, and the identities of its members. He positioned the coin carefully on the desk with a precision that suggested the object deserved more respect than anything else in the room. These coins were issued to the 12 Ghost Unit 7 operators who survived operations from 2009 to 2013. 4 operators did not survive. The 8 living members carry these coins as the only acknowledgement of their service that most of them will ever receive. No medals on record, no commendations in any file that Congress or the press or the public will ever access. Just a piece of metal and the knowledge of what they did. He looked at Sarah. Operator Mercer earned hers the way all of them did. Through actions that most of the world will never know about in places they will never hear, of protecting people who will never know they were in danger. Dalbeck, standing in the doorway, spoke. His voice was rough with emotion that 22 years of operational discipline couldn't fully suppress. Ma'am, we heard you were medically retired. Injuries from Kandahar. Sarah nodded slowly. The movement carried the weight of memories that she'd spent 12 years learning to manage, and that this evening had brought rushing back to the surface like floodwater through a broken dam. IED ambush during extraction, August 2012. Shrapnel collapsed my left lung, severed my radial artery, fractured my shoulder blade in 3 places. Greer continued the story. His voice changed as he spoke, losing the cold authority of command and taking on something deeper, the tone of a man bearing witness. Operator Mercer sustained those injuries 70 meters from the extraction point. The ambush had disabled the lead vehicle. 3 members of her team were wounded too critically. Standard protocol would have been to seek cover and wait for reinforcement. He paused. Operator Mercer did not follow standard protocol. The collective attention of every person present compressed into a single point of focus. With a collapsed lung and a severed artery that she tourniqueted with a strip torn from her own shirt, Operator Mercer rendered combat medical aid to 3 teammates while under sustained enemy fire. She stabilized 2 critical casualties using field surgical techniques that the attending physicians at Landstuhl would later describe as extraordinary, given the conditions. She maintained suppressive fire with her sidearm throughout the medical interventions, and she kept 2 men alive for 19 minutes until medevac arrived. The silence was absolute. One of those men was Petty Officer Marcus Dunn. The name detonated in the room with more force than any explosive Sarah had ever breached. Dunn, the man whose memorial service had brought Sarah to Coronado tonight. The man whose photograph stood on an easel draped in black cloth in the function room of the officers' club. The man whose crooked smile stared out from the folded program still tucked in the back pocket of Sarah's jeans. Petty Officer Dunn survived the Kandahar ambush because Operator Mercer kept him alive, Greer said. She patched the wounds that should have killed him. She held pressure on his femoral bleed for 11 minutes with one functioning arm. She talked him through shock while bullets impacted the ground within feet of their position. His voice roughened. The professional composure that flag officers maintain as armor against the emotional weight of their responsibilities developed a crack that he didn't try to repair. Marcus Dunn survived his physical wounds. His psychological wounds were another matter. Post-traumatic stress disorder took him last month. 12 years after Kandahar, the war he'd been fighting alone in his own mind finally won. He looked at Sarah. The memorial service tonight. That's why she was here. Dunn was her teammate, one of the men she saved. She came to honor him the way operators honor their own, quietly, privately, without seeking recognition or attention, because that is what people like Operator Mercer do. From the hallway, a sound. Small, broken, unmistakable. The sound of an elderly woman crying. Mrs. Eleanor Dunn had been standing outside the MP station for 20 minutes. She'd followed the group from the officers' club because something in her heart. The instinct of a mother who'd spent decades connected to the military world through her son had told her that the woman being led away in handcuffs was not what they said she was. Now she stood in the hallway with tears streaming down her face and her hand pressed over her mouth. She'd heard everything. Every word about Kandahar, about the ambush, about the 19 minutes that her son had survived because a woman with a collapsed lung and a torn artery had refused to let him die. She pushed past the officers in the hallway. No one stopped her. No one could have stopped her. She entered the room and walked directly to Sarah, who had risen from the metal chair and was standing with her hands at her sides, her expression finally completely irreversibly broken. "You brought my boy home," Eleanor said. Her voice shattered on every word, but she kept speaking. "You brought him home to me. I had 12 more years with my son because of you. 12 years of phone calls and holidays, and watching him try so hard to be okay." She took Sarah's hands, the scarred, calloused hands that had held weapons and tourniquets, and the fading pulse of a man who would have died in Afghan dust without them. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you for giving me those years. Thank you for what it cost you to give them." Sarah held the elderly woman's hands. The tears she'd held in check through the arrest. The interrogation, the exposure, and the accusations and the long minutes of endurance finally fell. Silent, steady. "He was the best of us, ma'am," she said. Her voice cracked on the words but didn't break. "I'm sorry I couldn't save him from the part that followed." They stood together for a long moment. 2 women connected by a man who was gone. A mother who'd lost a son, and a warrior who'd kept that son alive long enough for the mother to have 12 more years of love before the final goodbye. Greer let the moment breathe. Then, when the time was right, he gently guided Eleanor to a chair and turned to address the consequences that were waiting like loaded weapons around the room. He faced Thatcher first. The lieutenant stood against the wall. He was no longer leaning. He was pressing his back against the surface, as if trying to push through it to escape into the building's structure, to be anywhere other than standing in front of a general whose expression contained the kind of controlled fury that ended military careers the way lightning ends trees. Lieutenant Thatcher. Greer's voice was quiet. The quietness was worse than shouting. You publicly accused, physically assaulted, and orchestrated the arrest of a decorated combat veteran whose security clearance exceeds that of every person in this building except me. Each word landed with surgical precision. You humiliated her in front of dozens of witnesses. You allowed and encouraged the live broadcast of accusations of fraud against a woman who has given more to this country in 4 years of service than most personnel will contribute in entire careers. You seized classified military property and displayed it publicly while reading aloud a code designation that should never have been spoken outside a secure facility. Thatcher's mouth moved. No sound came out. And you did all of this based on assumptions, based on the fact that Operator Mercer didn't match your image of what a special warfare operator looks like, based on prejudice so deeply embedded in your thinking that you couldn't see past it even when every piece of evidence in front of you contradicted your conclusion. Greer stepped closer, close enough that Thatcher could see the fine lines around the general's eyes earned in decades of operations that this lieutenant would never know about. You have 5 seconds to apologize to Operator Mercer before I convene a general court-martial board and end your career in the most thorough and public way available to me under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Thatcher's composure collapsed. The arrogance that had sustained him through the evening, through the accusations and the arrest and the celebration at the bar, crumbled like a wall built on sand. I'm sorry. The words came out broken. Wet. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I should have. I should have asked. I should have listened. I'm sorry. Sarah looked at him, and in her expression was something that no one in the room expected. Not anger, not triumph, not the satisfaction of vindication after unjust accusation. Something far more complex, understanding. You didn't know, she said quietly, and you didn't try to find out. You decided what I was based on what you thought you knew about who belongs in this community, and you were wrong. She paused. I don't need your apology, Lieutenant, but the next woman you encounter who says she served, she might. You owe it to every female operator who's earned her place through blood and sacrifice to give her the same respect you'd give any brother in arms. Not because she's a woman, because she's a warrior. Thatcher couldn't speak. He nodded. The movement was small, broken, and genuine in a way that nothing he'd done all evening had been. Greer stepped back. Captain Faulkner, you are relieved of MP command effective immediately pending formal review of this evening's procedural failures. Faulkner removed her rank insignia. Her fingers were steady now, the shaking replaced by the controlled movements of someone performing a ritual they'd hoped would never be necessary. She placed the insignia on the nearest desk without ceremony. Lieutenant Thatcher, Lieutenant Sinclair, Petty Officer Cresswell, you are suspended from active duty, effective immediately pending investigation and disciplinary proceedings. 3 acknowledgments. 3 voices carrying the weight of futures that had just been fundamentally altered. Commander Keene, you will face administrative review for failure to pursue adequate verification before advancing federal charges against a veteran whose claims, while extraordinary, were supported by physical evidence and knowledge that warranted further investigation rather than prosecution. Keene nodded. His legal pad lay on the floor where it had fallen. He didn't pick it up. Commander Hodges? Greer turned to the base commander. New protocols. Effective Monday. Verification before accusation. Confirmation before arrest. Respect for all service members regardless of gender appearance or the visibility of their contributions. I want a complete review of stolen valor response procedures, and I want it on my desk in 72 hours. Yes, sir. The administrative demolition was complete. Greer turned to Sarah one final time. The room had emptied of all sound except the quiet breathing of people who had just witnessed something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Operator Mercer. On behalf of Naval Special Warfare Command, I apologize for your treatment tonight. This should never have happened. It will not happen again. Sarah met his eyes. It wasn't your fault, sir. It was my community. My responsibility. He paused. Then, with the careful tone of someone extending an offer they've thought about for a long time, he continued. I'd like to offer you a position. SEAL Training Advisory Board. Civilian consultant capacity. Mentoring female candidates entering the pipeline. Your choice of official or unofficial involvement. Sarah was quiet for a long time. The room waited. No, sir. The word surprised everyone, including Greer, whose eyebrows rose for the first time all evening. I didn't leave the shadows to find a spotlight general. I left because I needed peace. 12 years of therapy and night shifts and learning to sleep without reaching for a weapon. 12 years of building something that looks like a normal life. I'm not ready to walk back into that world, not even from the outside. Greer studied her, reading her the way he'd read hundreds of operators over 3 decades of command. Looking for fractures in the decision for doubt that might be leveraged for the hairline crack between what she wanted and what she needed. He found none. I understand, he said. The offer stands. Whenever you're ready. If you're ever ready. Sarah nodded. Then she looked past him toward the hallway, where the aftermath of the evening was still sorting itself into shapes that would take weeks to fully form. There is one thing I'll do. Name it. Maya Ellsworth, and the other 2 women currently in BUD/S first phase. I'll meet with them, once. No cameras, no recording, no official capacity. Just a conversation between women who've walked through the same fire at different times. Greer's expression softened by a degree that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Sarah noticed. She'd learned to read faces in environments where misreading an expression could get you killed. They don't need a symbol general. They need to know that someone who looks like them made it through and came out the other side still standing. That's all. That's enough. Done. I'll arrange it. Bramwell had quietly retrieved the broken chain and dog tags from the officers' club floor, while everyone else was focused on the interrogation. He'd brought them to the station and left them with the desk sergeant without explanation. Now, Whitfield handed the chain and tags to Sarah, along with the challenge coin that Greer had set on the desk. Sarah held the pieces in her palm. The chain was broken where Thatcher had snapped it. She knotted the 2 ends together with a simple twist that wasn't elegant, but held. Then she slipped the chain back over her head and tucked the coin and tags beneath her shirt against her skin where they'd rested for 12 years before tonight had pulled them into the light. Some things didn't need to be elegant. They just needed to hold. Greer checked his watch. It's 0400. You need rest and a medical evaluation. I'll drive you. My truck is in the officers' club lot, which Sinclair's video has made identifiable to several 100,000 people. We'll have someone move it to a secure location. For tonight, you're coming with me. Sarah didn't argue. She was too tired to argue. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the evening had metabolized into exhaustion, so profound that her bones felt hollow. The drive took 20 minutes through pre-dawn streets. Greer drove a government SUV. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, watching streetlights blur past in amber streaks. When Wolcott called me, Greer said after several minutes of silence, I was at Patterson's retirement dinner. Had to leave before dessert. Patterson's wife was not pleased. Sorry to ruin your evening, sir. Don't be. Patterson's retirement speeches are legendary for all the wrong reasons. You gave me an excellent excuse. The safe house was a modest cottage with ocean views. Greer cleared the rooms, showed her the kitchen, the bedroom, the secure phone. Get some sleep. I'll handle the fallout. Public Affairs will release a statement. Former Navy service member. Charges dropped. Verification confirmed. Nothing about Ghost Unit 7. Nothing about Neptune Spear. Just enough to clear your name. And Sinclair's video. Being removed. But screenshots exist. Your face will circulate for a while. Then the world will find something else to pay attention to. That's all I want, sir. To disappear again. I know. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Sarah, you handled tonight with more grace than I would have. Most people would have broken, would have revealed everything just to prove the accusers wrong. You didn't. That's why you were Ghost Unit 7. That's why you're still one of the finest operators I've ever known. After he left, Sarah stood in the silent cottage for a long time. Then she walked to the bedroom, laid down fully clothed on top of the covers, and closed her eyes. Sleep came. Not gently. It arrived the way it always arrived for people like her, pulling her under before she could negotiate terms. She dreamed of Kandahar, of Marcus bleeding into red sand, of her own hand steady despite the shrapnel in her arm and the fire in her chest holding pressure on a wound that wanted to take everything. She dreamed of the 4 who didn't come home, of the 3 who retired into lives that looked normal from the outside, of the 2 still active whose names she couldn't speak. 12 operators. Ghost Unit 7. Born in secrecy. Dissolved in silence. Remembered by no one except the 8 who survived and the 1 general who'd commanded them. She slept for 11 hours straight. The deepest sleep she'd had in months. The sleep of someone who'd carried a heavy burden for a very long time and had been allowed for 1 night to set it down. 6 months later, Sarah Mercer stood in the back row of a graduation ceremony at the Naval Special Warfare Center Coronado. The California sun turned everything gold. Families filled the bleachers, clutching small American flags and wiping their eyes. Instructors stood in formation along the perimeter, their faces carrying the particular pride of men who had spent months trying to break the people now standing before them, and who respected them precisely because they had refused to break. Maya Ellsworth stepped forward to receive her trident pin. She was 24 years old. Her uniform was sharp. Her eyes were clear. And when the commanding officer pressed the pin into the fabric above her heart, with the ceremonial force that tradition demanded, she didn't flinch. She stood there and took it the way operators take everything, with the understanding that the pain was the point, that the mark it left was the proof, and that what it represented was worth every second of suffering that had come before. Sarah watched from the last row. Jeans, plain shirt, sunglasses against the glare. No one recognized her. No one looked twice at the woman standing alone at the edge of the crowd with her hands clasped behind her back in a modified parade rest that she'd never fully unlearned. Greer found her after the ceremony. He stood beside her as the new operators celebrated with their families, as cameras flashed and tears fell, and the particular joy of achievement filled the air like music. "You made this possible," he said quietly. "No, sir. They made it possible. I just showed them the door was real." The advisory board offer still stands. Sarah watched Maya Ellsworth embrace her mother. Watched the young woman's face bright with accomplishment, carrying none of the weight that would come later, the weight that service always eventually demanded. She'd learn. They all learned. But today was not the day for that lesson. "I know it does, General, and I know where to find you if I'm ever ready." She left the ceremony alone, walked across the parking lot to her truck, which had been returned to her weeks ago, retrieved from the Officers Club lot, and delivered to her apartment without explanation. She climbed in, started the engine, pulled out of the lot and pointed the truck toward San Diego, toward her apartment and her evening shift at the firehouse, and the simple, unclassified act of saving lives that didn't require anyone to know her name. On the dashboard where she'd placed it that morning, the challenge coin caught the afternoon light through the windshield. GU7-041201. 12 stars for 12 operators. The silver chain knotted where Thatcher had broken it 6 months ago, lay coiled beside it. The knot wasn't elegant, but it held. And that, Sarah Mercer thought, as the Pacific Ocean disappeared in her rearview mirror and the San Diego skyline rose ahead of her, was enough. That had to be enough. Because for operators like her, for Ghost Unit 7, for all the warriors who served in silence and carried secrets that would never make it into history books, there was no parade, no monument, no chapter in any volume that school children would ever read. There was only the knowledge of what you did and the quiet certainty that it mattered, and the coin in your pocket that proved you were there even when the world would never know. Sarah Mercer drove toward her next shift. The sun was setting behind her. The road ahead was clear, and somewhere on her dashboard 12 stars caught the last light of the day and held it briefly before letting it go.